Hello everyone, in this video I'll be talking about the dancing plague in the medieval. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical informations. Medieval Europe was one of the most fragile periods in human history. Wars, famines, epidemics, and deep religious fears constantly threatened the daily lives of societies. People believed they were fighting not only physical enemies but also invisible dangers. The devil, curses, divine punishments, and unknown diseases were intertwined in the minds of medieval people. It was from this atmosphere that one of the strangest and most terrifying social epidemics in history emerged, the dancing plague. The dancing plague was a mysterious social catastrophe that appeared in various parts of Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern period, in which people danced involuntarily for hours, days, or even weeks. These people often moved ceaselessly until they collapsed from exhaustion, their muscles ached, or their hearts gave out. There was no music, no entertainment, no joy. On the contrary, these dances were accompanied by agonizing screams, fear, panic, and physical collapse. In medieval chronicles, these events are described as a disease, a curse, a divine punishment, or simply a demonic possession. People cried, screamed, crawled on the ground, sometimes whipped themselves, and sometimes attacked those around them while dancing. These behaviors were neither individual madness nor simple imitation. Because the dancing plague appeared not in a single person, but in hundreds or even thousands of people simultaneously. This was extremely shocking for medieval people. Because illnesses were usually spent in bed, weakening the body. The dancing plague, on the contrary, caused the body to move uncontrollably, completely eliminating willpower. People didn't want to dance, but they couldn't stop. This was perceived as a phenomenon that directly threatened the concept of free will. The origins of the dancing plague go back to the early Middle Ages. The first records appear in the 7th and 8th centuries in regions near the borders of present-day Germany and France. In these early cases, people began dancing uncontrollably around the tombs of saints or in front of churches. This behavior was often interpreted in a religious context. It was believed that those dancing had incurred the wrath of a saint or that their spirits had possessed them. Over time, these events escalated. In the 11th and 12th centuries, dancing plagues ceased to be isolated incidents, they became mass crises affecting villages, towns, and even cities. During this period, Europe was shaken by the trauma of the Crusades, famines, and epidemics. The spiritual structure of society was extremely fragile. The dancing plague began to appear as an outward manifestation of this spiritual pressure through the body. The dancers often entered a trance-like state. Their eyes fixed, they lost contact with their surroundings, and foamed at the mouth. Some threw themselves into thorny bushes, some struck stones, and some tore their clothes and ran through the streets. Chronicles wrote that these individuals did not feel pain and were not even aware that they were injured. This situation was seen by the people of that era as clear evidence of supernatural intervention. One of the most terrifying aspects of the dancing plague was its contagiousness. When one person began to dance, those watching quickly began to perform the same movements. This contagion did not require physical contact. Sometimes, simply watching was enough. This created great panic in medieval society. Because people began to fear not only diseases but also the behavior of others. Authorities, priests, and physicians were helpless in the face of this situation. Some argued that it was a demonic possession and performed exorcism rituals. Others, believing that God was punishing sinful communities, organized collective prayers, fasts, and ceremonies. However, most of these methods made the situation worse. Because during religious ceremonies, people would start dancing again, and the crisis would escalate. The dancing plague threatened not only individuals but also the order of medieval society. Fields were left empty, shops closed, trade ceased, and families were torn apart. Dancers sometimes could not return home for days, collapsing in the streets. Some people lose their lives in this process. Causes of death include heart attack, stroke, dehydration, and extreme fatigue. Thus, the dance plague is, in a true sense, a deadly social disease. At this point, the dance plague takes shape not only as a medical mystery but also as a psychological, cultural, and social catastrophe. For medieval man, the body is the mirror of the soul. If the soul is sick, the body is also out of control. Dancing bodies are, in fact, the visible manifestation of the spiritual collapse of society. The dancing plague was not the product of a single moment or a single geography in medieval Europe. Rather, it was a form of collective catastrophe that reappeared repeatedly at different times and in different regions over the centuries. Therefore, to understand it, it is necessary to look not only at the most famous cases, but also at the earlier, silent but widespread epidemics. These events, hidden between the lines of chronicles, reveal just how deeply rooted and profound the dancing plague actually was. Some monastic records from the 18th and 19th century speak of people exhibiting movements, against the will of God, in regions within the borders of present-day Germany and France. The word dance does not always appear explicitly in these texts, however, expressions such as uncontrolled leaping, the body losing its will, and unending movement, are considered early signs of the dancing plague that would be defined later. These early cases often occurred around the tombs of saints or on holy days. In these places where people came to pray, they suddenly began to tremble, spin, shout, and move, and these behaviors quickly spread to the crowds. By the 12th century, the dancing plague was beginning to be defined more clearly. During this period, towns along the Rhine River in Germany became centers of these bizarre outbreaks. Chronicles describe the emergence of dancing crowds, particularly in the aftermath of famine and plague. As people lived under the fear of hunger, disease, and death, their bodies seemed unable to withstand the pressure and took control. Dance, here, was not entertainment, it was a bodily expression of pain and fear. And in the 12th and 13th centuries, events took an even more dramatic turn. During this period, the dancing plague was no longer seen only as individual crises, but as organized collective movements. Chronicles describe hundreds of people gathering and dancing simultaneously in the streets, on bridges, and in churchyards. These people sometimes held hands, sometimes formed chains, and sometimes fell to the ground and then jumped back up. The movements were irregular, but there was a shared sense of rhythm. Interestingly, although there was no real music, the dancers claimed to hear imaginary melodies. The testimonies of this period clearly show that the dancing plague had not only a physical but also a mental dimension. Some dancers recount seeing saints, hearing divine voices, and encountering visions of hell. Others say that the devil was forcing them, and that if they stopped, they would be punished with an even greater catastrophe. These accounts are extremely important for understanding how medieval people perceived the world. Reality and fantasy, body and soul, fear and faith were not clearly separated during this period. In the 19th century, cases of dancing plague intensified especially during religious holidays. Easter, St. Vitus' Day, and St. John's Day were the times when these outbreaks were most frequent. This suggests that the dancing plague was directly linked to religious fervor. Long fasts, intense prayers, and the fear of sin made people's mental balance even more fragile. The body responded to this pressure with involuntary movements. One of the most terrifying scenes described in the chronicles is that of dancers becoming insensitive to pain. People would jump until their feet bled, spin on thorny plants, and stomp on the stone floor for hours. It was recorded that foot bones were broken, muscles torn, and some people suffered permanent disabilities during this process. Despite this, the dance did not stop. On the contrary, the pain intensified the dance. While this might suggest a kind of dissociative state from a modern perspective, for medieval people it was a clear sign of the supernatural. The contagiousness of the dance plague is also frequently emphasized in chronicles. The movement, starting in one town, quickly spreads to neighboring villages. Those watching the dancers begin to perform the same movements within a few hours. This form of spread indicates a social hysteria beyond a physical illness. People share not only their bodies but also their fears. Fear is the strongest trigger for the dance. Authorities are often helpless in the face of this situation. There are cases where military force has been used to disperse the dancers. However, these methods are usually ineffective. People who are forcibly stopped either faint or soon begin dancing again. In some towns, however, the authorities do the opposite. Musicians are called in, and dancers are allowed to complete the rhythm. This approach, paradoxically, led in some cases to the gradual fading of dance. These first major epidemics show that the dance plague was not merely a medical mystery, but a mirror of the spiritual state of medieval society. A society living under the fear of hunger, war, disease, and divine punishment had become incapable of controlling its own body. Dance, here, was not entertainment, it was a form of collective collapse. The cases described in this chapter form the historical basis of the dance plague. But the most famous and best documented of these events has yet to be told. The moment the dancing plague was etched into history was the Great Epidemic in Strasbourg in 1518. This event would make the dancing plague one of the strangest social catastrophes not only of the Middle Ages but of human history. The summer of 1518 is etched in European history not only for its heat, but also for a catastrophe that defied the limits of human intellect. Strasbourg, at that time, was one of the important cities of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a city at the crossroads of trade routes, where religious authority was strong, but also one struggling with poverty, hunger, and disease. A long-standing famine, rotting crops, rising taxes, and epidemics had exhausted the city's inhabitants physically and mentally. It was in this fragile atmosphere that the most famous dancing plague in history broke out. It all began in July 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophia suddenly began dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. According to the chronicles, she neither heard any music nor was she enjoying herself. Her face was filled with pain, her body moved uncontrollably. She danced for hours without stopping. Those around her initially interpreted it as a case of personal madness. But the next day, Frau Trophia was still dancing. By the end of the third day, her feet were covered in blood, but she could not stop. The real disaster began when this behavior wasn't limited to him alone. Soon, a few people who had followed him also started dancing. Then dozens, then hundreds, shared the same fate. As the days passed, the streets, squares, and churchyards of Strasbourg filled with people dancing involuntarily. Chronicles record that approximately 400 people succumbed to this madness within a month. Some sources suggest the number was even higher. These people were not joyful. Their faces showed tension, fear, and pain. Some were crying, some were shouting, and some were praying. Many of the dancers said they wanted to stop, but their bodies wouldn't allow it. This situation caused great fear among the city's inhabitants, because now everyone knew that this was not just an individual problem. This was an epidemic threatening the entire community. The authorities didn't know what to do. The city council consulted physicians. The medical understanding of the time was still based on the four humors theory inherited from ancient Greece. The physicians interpreted the dancing plague as overheating of the blood. According to them, excess heat and blood accumulating in the body were forcing people to move. The solution was surprising: dancing. Doctors argued that stopping the dancers would be even more dangerous. In line with this view, the city administration made one of the most ironic decisions in history. Stages were erected in open spaces in Strasbourg. Musicians were hired. Special areas were created for the dancers. The aim was to allow people to release their excess kinetic energy in a controlled manner. However, this decision, instead of alleviating the disaster, exacerbated it. Music became a powerful element triggering the dancing plague. More people began to dance. The streets were now filled not only with those involuntarily moving, but also with terrified crowds watching them. Some dancers went without sleep for days. They went thirsty and hungry. Some fainted and then got up again and continued dancing. Chronicles indicate that during this process, there were those who suffered heart attacks, strokes, and deaths. Deaths often occurred silently. A person would collapse while dancing and never get up again. At this point, religious authority intervened. The church argued that the event was a spiritual, not a medical, matter. It claimed that the dancing plague demonstrated a sinful society being tested by divine punishment. It was particularly believed to be a manifestation of the wrath of Saint Vitus, a figure associated with nervous disorders and involuntary movements in the Middle Ages. Therefore, the dancing plague was long known as Saint Vitus's dance. Church authorities ordered the dancers to be removed from Strasbourg and taken to sanctuaries dedicated to Saint Vitus. They were led through mountain paths to small chapels. Holy symbols were tied to their feet, holy water was sprinkled on them, and prayers were recited. Interestingly, in some cases, the dancing gradually ceased after these rituals. This was interpreted by medieval people as evidence of divine intervention. The 1518 Strasbourg dancing plague is remarkable not only for its scale but also for its extensive documentation. City records, medical reports, and religious texts have preserved the details of this event to this day. These documents clearly show that the dancing plague was not a figment of imagination, but a real social crisis. After this event, the dancing plague secured a permanent place in Europe's collective memory. People witnessed how the body can detach from the will, and how fear and belief can seize control of a person. The Strasbourg case reveals one of the darkest aspects of human psychology, not only in the Middle Ages but also in the context of the dancing plague. The 1518 Strasbourg incident made the dancing plague one of the most visible social crises in history. However, both contemporaries and modern researchers have been puzzled by the same question since then: why did people dance? Was there a physical illness behind this behavior, or was it a sign of mental and social collapse? While medieval people mostly offered religious answers to this question, the modern age has attempted to understand this phenomenon through scientific and psychological frameworks. In the medieval world, the concept of illness was not based on biological causes in the way we understand it today. The human body was seen as a direct reflection of the soul. Therefore, loss of control over the body was considered a sign of spiritual corruption. In this context, the dancing plague was interpreted as a divine test for a sinful society. Figures like Saint Vitus and Saint John were associated with involuntary movements and neurological disorders. People believed they had incurred the wrath of these saints. However, medieval physicians were not entirely silent either. The medical knowledge of the time was based on the theory of the four humors inherited from ancient Greece. According to this theory, the human body contained four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance of these fluids led to disease. The dancing plague was interpreted, in particular, as overheating of the blood or overflowing bile. This view was based on the idea that the body released excess energy through movement. This theory also formed the basis of the unfortunate decisions made in Strasbourg. Encouraging dancers to continue dancing, rather than stopping them, was presented as a medical solution. However, this approach is highly problematic from a modern perspective because it ignores the contagious aspect of the dancing plague. People dancing drew others into the same behavior. It wasn't a bodily release, but a social trigger. Modern historians and psychologists often explain the dancing plague using the concept of mass psychogenic illness. In such illnesses, there is no physical pathogen. Instead, intense stress, fear, and trauma are expressed through the body. Medieval Europe offered an extremely favorable environment for this type of condition. Famines, epidemics, wars, and religious persecution had severely weakened people's mental resilience. The dancing plague can be seen as a collective release of this oppression. People couldn't consciously express their fears because disobedience was considered a sin. However, the body rejected this oppression and reacted with uncontrolled movements. Dance, here, was not a form of rebellion, it was an involuntary collapse. Another important theory is ergotism, also known as ergot poisoning. The ergot fungus appears in rye grown in humid conditions and creates hallucinogenic effects. People who consume this substance may experience convulsions, tremors, hallucinations, and uncontrolled movements. In the Middle Ages, rye was a staple food, especially for the poor. Therefore, it has been suggested that the dancing plague may be linked to ergot poisoning. However, this theory is also insufficient to explain every case. While ergotism is generally effective in specific regions and for short periods, dancing plague has repeatedly appeared in different geographies over centuries. Furthermore, the behaviors seen in dancing plague are more complex and prolonged than the typical symptoms of poisoning. Therefore, many researchers argue that ergotism may be effective in some cases, but it is not the sole explanatory factor. Another dimension of dancing plague is the effect of social imitation and expectation. Medieval people believed that the world was governed by supernatural powers. One person starting to dance triggered the thought in others that the same fate awaited them. This expectation made the physical symptoms real. People experienced what they feared. At this point, dancing plague shows similarities to the phenomenon known in modern psychology as the nocebo effect. A person's belief that they will be harmed can actually lead to harm. In medieval society, this effect became extremely powerful, combined with religious fears. In this respect, dancing plague cannot be explained solely as a disease, solely as hysteria, or solely as divine punishment. This phenomenon is a complex social one, where all these elements are intertwined. The body, mind, beliefs, and environmental conditions are all at play simultaneously. In the Middle Ages, religion was not merely a belief system, but an absolute framework regulating all aspects of life. Diseases, disasters, and social crises were explained by God's will. Therefore, it was inevitable that an unbelievable phenomenon like the dancing plague would acquire a religious meaning. People saw their inability to control their bodies not only as a physical problem, but also as a sign of spiritual decay. The dancing body was seen as a severed relationship with God. It was no coincidence that most cases of the dancing plague occurred in churchyards, around saints' tombs, or on religious holidays. For medieval people, sacred places were not only places of worship, but also areas where supernatural powers were closest to the world. Unusual behavior in these areas was considered clear evidence of divine intervention. The dancing plague is most often associated with Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus is a saint in Christian tradition who was tortured and killed at a young age, and over time he has become a protective figure for nervous disorders, convulsions, and involuntary movements. In medieval Europe, particularly in Germany and surrounding areas, the expression "dance of Saint Vitus" was widely used. People believed that the uncontrolled movements were a result of the saint's wrath or trial. This belief also shaped the methods of combating the dancing plague. Dancers were often taken to chapels dedicated to Saint Vitus, where they participated in days of prayers, fasting, and ceremonies. They were given red shoes to wear, sacred symbols were drawn on them, and sometimes amulets and talismans bearing the saint's name were worn. The aim of these rituals was the healing of the soul, not the body. Interestingly, in some cases, the dancing reportedly ended after these practices. From a modern perspective, this could be interpreted as the result of strong psychological suggestion. Long rites, intense hymns, repetitive rituals, and crowded environments put people into trance-like states. This facilitated involuntary movements, especially in spiritually fragile individuals. Thus, religion, while presented as a solution on the one hand, became part of the problem on the other. The religious dimension of the dancing plague also reflects the medieval society's perception of the body. The body is a tool that should be at the service of the soul. A body out of control is a sign that the soul has become separated from God. Therefore, dancing bodies were not only sick, they were dangerous. Because these bodies could drag others into the same fate. As seen in this section, the dancing plague was not only a disease but also a crisis of meaning in the religious world of the Middle Ages. People turned to God, saints, and curses to explain this catastrophe. However, these explanations often deepened the fear instead of reducing it. The dancing plague became a crisis in medieval Europe, shaking not only the bodies of individuals but the entire structure of society. Such outbreaks caused far greater devastation than the disease itself. Because the dancers were not merely bodies moving uncontrollably, they were also workers cut off from production, parents forced to abandon their families, and individuals marginalized by the established order. The dancing plague exposed the fragility of medieval society in all its starkness. When the dancing plague began in a town, daily life would almost completely come to a standstill. Fields wouldn't be plowed, harvests wouldn't be gathered, and craftsmen couldn't open their shops. A large proportion of the dancers came from the lower classes. Farmers, laborers, servants, and poor women were the groups most affected. This further crippled the already struggling local economy. The fear of starvation became both a cause and a consequence of the dancing plague. The situation was even more complex in cities located along trade routes. In centers like Strasbourg, the dancing plague affected not only the local population but also merchants and travelers. People passing through the city panicked and fled upon seeing this bizarre sight. This led to disruptions in trade, rising prices, and deepening famine. Thus, the dancing plague created an economic chain reaction. One of the biggest problems in terms of social order was the undermining of authority. In the Middle Ages, the mainstays of order were the church, the nobility, and local administrators. However, none of these authorities could offer a definitive solution in the face of the dancing plague. Doctors said different things, priests offered different interpretations, and administrators often remained indecisive. This weakened the public's trust in authority. Cases where attempts were made to forcibly stop the dancers often resulted in violence. When soldiers or city guards tried to disperse the dancers, they were met with public resistance. Because people believed that these people were cursed and that harming them would trigger an even greater catastrophe. Thus, the authority was caught between intervening and not intervening. The family structure was also seriously affected by the dancing plague. Individuals who participated in the dance were unable to return home for days, sometimes weeks. Children were left unattended, and spouses became estranged. Some chronicles describe the breakdown of marriages, increased inheritance disputes, and weakened social bonds during the dance plague. This further eroded the already fragile social structure of medieval society. The dance plague also brought about processes of exclusion and stigmatization. Even after the epidemic ended, dancers were still seen as dangerous in the eyes of society. These people were sometimes accused of witchcraft, sometimes of collaborating with the devil. Women, in particular, became targets of these accusations. The dance plague can also be considered one of the elements that fueled the mental infrastructure of witch hunts. During this period, help and solidarity did not completely disappear. In some towns, people brought water and food to the dancers and tried to let them rest in the shade. However, this help was often a form of pity mixed with fear. No one wanted to get too close to these people, fearing that they too might contract the dance plague. In addition to its economic and social impacts, the dancing plague also altered the medieval person's perception of time. Days and nights blurred together, and it became uncertain whether the dancers would ever stop. This uncertainty created a state of constant anticipation. People lived with the fear that a new catastrophe could erupt at any moment. In this respect, the dancing plague is similar to other major catastrophes of the Middle Ages. Like the Black Death, famines, and wars, this epidemic tested society's resilience. However, what distinguishes the dancing plague is that the catastrophe was visible and dynamic. Death did not come silently, but through bodies dancing in the streets. The impact of these events was not limited to the Middle Ages. The dancing plague was remembered in subsequent centuries, interpreted in different ways, and inspired thinkers who sought to understand human behavior. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, an intellectual transformation began in Europe. The Renaissance offered a new, human-centered perspective. Natural phenomena and human behavior were increasingly being explained by reason. However, deeply rooted fears like the dancing plague left profound marks that this transformation could not immediately erase. People were now beginning to question the workings of the body and mind as much as they questioned the devil and saints. While the number of dancing plague cases decreased in the 16th and 17th centuries, it did not disappear completely. Instead, these events began to be examined from a different perspective. Renaissance physicians, unlike their medieval counterparts, approached the human body more systematically. Concepts such as the nervous system, muscles, and brain gradually began to enter medical literature. The dancing plague was no longer seen merely as divine punishment, but also as a nervous disorder. Some medical texts written during this period associate the dancing plague with melancholia. Melancholia was a state of deep sadness and mental imbalance explained by an excess of black bile. Physicians suggested that prolonged stress and fear could drive the body to involuntary movements. These interpretations can be considered early precursors of modern psychology. However, religious explanations had not completely disappeared. The Church was now addressing the dance plague with more caution. Instead of explicitly calling it the work of the devil, concepts such as spiritual weakness and moral decay came to the forefront. This shows that religious discourse was not entirely abandoned, but had changed form. By the 19th century, scientific thought had further strengthened in Europe. Descartes and similar thinkers opened up discussions about the relationship between body and mind. During this period, the dance plague began to be seen as a strange relic of the past. However, this perspective did not mean that the event was completely forgotten. On the contrary, the example of the dance plague was used as proof of how fragile the human mind can be. In history books written during this period, the dance plague is often described as a product of the age of ignorance. However, this approach ignores the social dimension of the event. Because the dance plague was a result not only of a lack of information, but also of intense trauma. During the Renaissance and beyond, similar social pressures would continue to manifest themselves in different forms. One of the reasons for the decline of the dance plague was the change in social structure. The strengthening of central authorities, the more regulated nature of health practices, and the more controlled application of religious rituals prevented such mass crises. People were now more inclined to explain disasters not by individual sins, but by social and environmental causes. However, it is not possible to say that the dance plague completely disappeared. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the stressful environment created by industrialization, similar mass behavioral disorders were observed. Although these were not called the dance plague, they were essentially based on the same social dynamics. The human body continued to react similarly under intense pressure. This period allowed for a re-evaluation of the dance plague as a historical phenomenon. The question was no longer, was this a curse, but why do human communities react in this way? This change paved the way for the birth of modern psychology. However, the impact of the dance plague was not limited to history books. This event also left a profound mark on art, literature, and popular culture. The dancing plague was not merely a catastrophe in medieval Europe, it also became a powerful symbol of humanity's relationship with death, fear, and loss of control. These events left a deep mark on the art, literature, and collective memory of the period. Dancing bodies became a representation not only of sick people but of humanity's fragility. Medieval art was largely shaped around religious themes. In this context, the dancing plague was particularly associated with motifs such as the dance of death or danse macabre. Scenes of skeletons and living people dancing hand in hand are frequently seen in frescoes, illuminated manuscripts, and church decorations. These images emphasize that death is inevitable for everyone and that no social status can save a person from this fate. These visuals, shaped by the influence of the dancing plague, not only offer an aesthetic narrative but also carry a powerful moral message. The human body is the carrier of worldly desires and sins, and when left unchecked, it leads to disaster. The dancing body, in this respect, symbolizes both sin and punishment. This symbolism ensured that the fear created by the dance plague was immortalized through art. A similar trend is seen in literature. In some texts written in the Middle Ages and early modern period, dancing crowds are depicted as a manifestation of divine justice. In these narratives, dance is associated not with joy and entertainment, but with helplessness, fear, and inevitable end. The dancing characters are often figures who move without knowing their own end. This emphasizes the powerlessness of man in the face of fate. The representations of the dance plague in art are also important in terms of social memory. These images have been passed down through generations, creating a collective fear. When people saw dancing bodies, they remembered not only an event that happened in the past, but also a potential future. Because the idea that such catastrophes could recur always remained alive in the minds of medieval people. In the Renaissance and afterwards, these representations began to take on a more secular form. The motifs of the death dance, detached from their religious context, became philosophical symbols describing the mortality of man. Even though the dance plague is no longer directly depicted, the uncontrolled movements of bodies and chaotic scenes bear the traces of this historical phenomenon. Artists use these images to illustrate how fragile humanity's search for reason and order is. The cultural impact of the dance plague is not limited to the visual arts. Echoes of this catastrophe can also be seen in folk tales, fables, and legends. In some regions, there are stories of cursed spirits dancing in the streets at night. These stories are told to children to serve as a cautionary tale and reinforce social norms. Dance, here, serves not as entertainment but as a warning. Even in the modern era, the dance plague has remained a cultural point of reference. In works written in the fields of psychology, sociology, and history, this event is treated as an extreme example of mass behavior. In popular culture, themes of uncontrolled crowds, hysteria, and chaos can be seen as modern reflections of the dance plague. This section examines the effects of the dance plague on art and culture. However, to complete this narrative, one more step is needed. Because the dance plague is not merely a phenomenon of the past, it is a dark and recurring aspect of human nature. Therefore, modern psychology and sociology have examined this phenomenon again and again. The dance plague is not merely a historical curiosity for modern psychology and sociology. Rather, it offers a unique example of how the human mind behaves under pressure. These events, which occurred centuries ago, provide modern scientists with a powerful case study showing how mass behavior, trauma, and social stress manifest in the body. Modern psychology often examines the dance plague under the heading of mass psychogenic disorder, or social hysteria. In such cases, there is no infectious microbe or biological pathogen involved. Instead, intense fear, stress, and anticipation create real physical symptoms in the human body. These symptoms are not mimicry, individuals truly suffer, truly experience a loss of control. Medieval Europe offered an extremely conducive environment for this kind of psychological collapse. People living under the constant threat of death had no guarantee of the future. Plague, war, famine, and religious persecution eroded the mental resilience of individuals. According to modern psychology, such chronic stress situations dismantle the mind's defense mechanisms. The body expresses unexpressed emotions through movement. The uncontrolled movements seen in the dancing plague are similar to what are now called dissociative states. In such states, the individual temporarily loses conscious control. When the mind cannot manage the trauma experienced, it takes over the body. In this sense, the people dancing were not making conscious decisions, their bodies had taken on the burden of emotions they could not bear. Another important concept is mirror neurons and imitative behavior. People tend to unconsciously imitate the behavior of others. This tendency is even stronger, especially in situations of fear and panic. Seeing someone dancing in Strasbourg or other medieval cities could trigger a similar reaction in the observer. This process is key to the transition from an individual crisis to a collective catastrophe. Another striking element in the dancing plague is expectation and belief. People believed that such a catastrophe was possible. The wrath of saints, demonic possessions, and curses provided a ready-made mental framework. In modern psychology, this is considered a powerful form of suggestion. When a person believes something bad is going to happen, the body can turn that expectation into reality. In this respect, the dancing plague shows similarities to some mass panic incidents experienced in the modern age. Mass fainting spells, sudden outbreaks of fear, and unexplained bodily symptoms have occurred in different societies and at different times. The common point is intense stress and uncertainty. The dancing plague represents the historical origin of such events. Modern psychology also attempts to explain why the dancing plague lasts so long. For a person to dance for hours or days seems physically impossible at first glance. However, excessive adrenaline release, suppression of pain perception, and dissociative states allow the body to temporarily exceed its normal limits. This also explains why dancers don't realize they are getting injured. The dancing plague also reveals the relationship between social pressure and gender. The fact that women are prominent in a large proportion of cases has attracted the attention of modern researchers. In the Middle Ages, women were under greater pressure, both economically and religiously. Their opportunities to express their emotions were extremely limited. Dance plague can also be interpreted as a bodily manifestation of this repression. Modern science no longer views dance plague as a mysterious or supernatural event. However, this does not diminish its terrifying nature. On the contrary, it shows how easily the human mind can be broken and how social conditions can take over the body. Dance plague profoundly shakes the very idea that humans are rational beings. The dancing plague is often recounted in history books as a bizarre and incomprehensible medieval story. However, to view this phenomenon solely as a peculiarity of the past misses its true meaning. The dancing plague is a universal example of how human nature can be broken under social pressure. Therefore, it is important not only for understanding the Middle Ages, but also for understanding the present and the future. Modern societies possess far more advanced medical knowledge, communication tools, and scientific explanations than the Middle Ages. Yet, mass fears, panics, and states of loss of control still occur. The difference has changed, the form has changed. But the essence has largely remained the same. In this respect, the dancing plague is a historical mirror of humanity's repressed fears. Today, dancing crowds may no longer appear involuntarily in the streets. However, even in the modern world, people can exhibit irrational behavior collectively. Financial panics, mass fears, waves of social hysteria, and sudden behavioral changes can be considered contemporary equivalents of the dancing plague. Instead of the human body, this time it is the behavior of society that becomes uncontrollable. One of the most important lessons the dance plague teaches us is that a human being is not merely an individual entity. A person carries the mood of the society in which they live. In the Middle Ages, this mood was shaped by religious fears and the threat of death. Today, uncertainty, speed, loneliness, and a constant feeling of being under pressure are paramount. However, in both cases, the result is similar: when the mind cannot bear the burden, the body or behaviors take over. This phenomenon also questions the modern belief in human rationality. The dance plague shows that reason is not always the controlling force. In times of crisis, a person can become an extremely fragile being. Social stress can override individual will. Medieval people explained this with saints and curses. Modern people, on the other hand, name it in scientific terms. However, the experience is essentially similar. The dance plague also reminds us that the body is a means of communication. Unspoken fears, unexpressed pains are sometimes expressed through the body. In the Middle Ages, this form of expression was dance. Today, these manifest as various psychosomatic reactions, anxiety disorders, collective stress responses, and behavioral crises. The body still carries the burden of the mind. This historical phenomenon also questions the role of authority. In the Middle Ages, the church and local rulers often didn't know what to do in the face of the dancing plague. Wrong decisions aggravated the disaster. This is also true for modern societies. Decisions made in times of crisis can either alleviate fear or deepen it. The dancing plague is an early example showing that authority should act with understanding, not just knowledge. The reason the dancing plague is so strongly etched in memory is the human fear of losing control. Humans want to believe they control their minds and bodies. However, this event shows how fragile this belief is. Humans are not only biological beings, they are also social and psychological beings. When the balance between these three areas is disrupted, unimaginable behaviors can emerge. Therefore, the dancing plague is not just a dark page of the Middle Ages. It is part of humanity's shared story. It is a warning about where fear, oppression, and uncertainty can lead people. Understanding this phenomenon today means not judging the past, but recognizing human nature. Historical assessments of the dance plague show that this phenomenon was not limited to a specific geography or period. While the Strasbourg case is the best-known example, traces of similar mass behaviors have been found in different parts of Europe. This suggests that the dance plague was not a singular event, but a recurring human reaction under specific conditions. Societies changed, belief systems transformed, but the fragile nature of the human mind remained largely the same. One of the fundamental factors behind such mass movements is collective memory and cultural transmission mechanisms. Medieval societies passed down their fears and traumas from generation to generation through oral narratives, religious symbols, and rituals. The dance plague emerged as a product of this collective memory. People believed that such an event was possible. This belief facilitated the spread of the catastrophe. In modern societies, this role is taken over by media, social networks, and rapid information circulation. The long-term effects of the dance plague also left their mark on the intellectual world of the time. Following these events, the Church was forced to reconsider its approach to the human body and soul. Some clergymen began to realize the destructive effects of overly punitive and fear-based teachings on human psychology. This awareness, though slow and limited, led to a partial softening of religious discourse towards the end of the Middle Ages. Similarly, the understanding of medicine was also affected by the dance plague. Physicians realized that they needed to consider not only the body but also the state of mind. This process can be considered a very early and primitive precursor to modern psychiatry. Although the knowledge of the time was insufficient, the idea that human behavior could not be explained solely by physical causes gradually gained strength. The dance plague is also important for understanding the relationship between the individual and society. An individual, when considered alone, may be rational and controlled. However, in crowds, the same individual can transform into a completely different being. In the Middle Ages, this transformation manifested itself through dance. Today, it appears in different forms. This situation also opens up a discussion about the concept of individual responsibility. Were the people dancing guilty, or were they victims of their circumstances? Modern historiography leans more towards the second view. This event also brings to the forefront the concept of social resilience. Societies where the dance plague emerged were weak in coping with crises. Social support mechanisms were limited. People were alone and left to face their fears. Today, however, the responses of societies to similar crises depend on the strength of their solidarity networks. In this respect, the dance plague also serves as a historical warning. Understanding the dance plague does not mean belittling medieval people. On the contrary, it allows us to understand them better. These people behaved this way not because of ignorance, but because they were crushed under excessive pressure. Today, our possession of scientific knowledge does not completely protect us from similar collapses. Because knowledge does not always prevail over emotions. When a person is afraid, they can put reason aside. In conclusion, the dance plague is not a marginal event in human history, but a central turning point. This event clearly shows how social pressure, fear, and uncertainty shape human behavior. Dancing bodies are the loudest expression of a silent age. They are a history written by the body of those who cannot speak, cannot object, and are forced to suppress their fears. Therefore, the dance plague is not merely a tragedy of the past, but a warning relevant to every age. Humanity repeatedly tests its limits in times of crisis. Remembering how easily these limits can be crossed is perhaps the first step in preventing the recurrence of such catastrophes. The dancing plague can also be understood through the lens of medieval man's relationship with nature. During this period, nature was not perceived as something man could control, rather, it was seen as a constantly threatening, unpredictable, and often hostile force. Droughts, floods, epidemics, and sudden climate changes reinforced man's sense of fate. The dancing plague can also be seen as a physical manifestation of this helplessness in the face of nature. Man had become unable to control his own body in the face of a nature he could not control. Climate historians draw connections between some periods of intense dancing plague and the cooling phase known as the Little Ice Age. Shorter summers, poor harvests, and increasing famines led to increased societal stress. In this context, the dancing plague is a multidimensional crisis triggered not only by cultural or psychological factors but also by environmental conditions. The human body bore the weight of the pressure created by the climate. The dancing plague also raises interesting questions regarding the concepts of law and crime. The medieval legal system was based on the will of the individual. However, the dancers were not acting of their own free will. This situation also put the legal scholars of the time in a difficult position. Could a dancer be considered guilty? Should they be punished for disturbing public order, or should they be seen as mentally ill? There were no clear answers to these questions, and arbitrary practices often emerged. In some cities, dancers were chained up, while in others they were exiled. However, such harsh measures often exacerbated the problem rather than solving it. From a modern perspective, this situation can be considered an early example showing how incorrect interventions applied to traumatized individuals deepen the crisis. The dance plague also revealed the inadequacy of the state and authorities in crisis management. This event also highlights the limitations of language. What happened during the dance plague could not be fully expressed in the language of the time. Chronicles often use expressions such as unthinkable, unspeakable, and indescribable. This shows the difficulty of putting traumatic experiences into words. As long as people could not describe what they experienced, their bodies continued to speak. The dance plague also offers clues about how social memory is shaped. Even after the events ended, the stories of the dancers were told for generations. These narratives became intertwined with legends over time. Real events were embellished with exaggerations and symbols. However, the preservation of these narratives shows that society does not want to forget this trauma. Unforgotten catastrophes are warnings left for the future. Readings made through the female body further deepen the gender dimension of the dance plague. The increased visibility of women was interpreted as their being emotionally weak. However, modern historians emphasize that this is a prejudice. Because women had less say in society, they could not find other channels to express their emotional burdens. Dance was the breaking of this silence through the body. The dance plague is also noteworthy from the perspective of children. Some sources state that young people and children also participated in these movements. This suggests the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Children learn by imitating the fear and panic around them. The dance plague is an early example of how social trauma spreads. From a theological perspective, the dance plague also influenced the conception of God. While some clergymen believed that God was testing humanity, others linked these events to the limits of God's mercy. These debates led to a rethinking of human free will and divine intervention in medieval theology. Dancing bodies raised not only worldly but also metaphysical questions. The dance plague is one of the silent companions of the transformation seen in European thought towards the end of the Middle Ages. On the road to the Renaissance, as the human body and mind were rediscovered, the questioning created by such mass crises was also influential. Humanity began to be seen not only as a sinful being but also as a complex, fragile being that needed to be understood. From all these perspectives, the dance plague is a phenomenon too broad to be explained by a single discipline. It stands at the intersection of history, psychology, sociology, environmental sciences, and philosophy. Therefore, it is still researched, still debated, and still arouses interest. Humanity faces crises that push its limits in every era. These crises sometimes manifest as war, sometimes as epidemics, and sometimes as invisible pressures. In the Middle Ages, this pressure became visible in the form of dancing bodies. Today, it appears in different forms. However, the human response is essentially similar. Therefore, understanding the dance plague is not only about gaining knowledge about the past, it is about rethinking what it means to be human. This event shows the human condition. It reveals both its resilience and its fragility. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: when a person is not allowed to rest, to make sense of, and to express themselves, the body begins to speak. The dance plague, when considered with all its historical, psychological, economic, and cultural layers, emerges as one of the great turning points in humanity's collective memory. This event transcends the boundaries of a specific century or geography. It transforms into a universal narrative about the fragile nature of being human. Although the dancing bodies emerged in the streets of medieval Europe, the meaning they carry is timeless. Philosophically, the dance plague clearly reveals the tension between human free will and necessity. Humans desire to see themselves as free and conscious subjects. However, the dance plague demonstrates how vulnerable this subject is to social, environmental, and psychological conditions. Will is not always absolute. Sometimes, a person becomes a spectator of their own actions. This situation, similar to the questioning of the concept of subject in modern philosophy, was effectively experienced in the Middle Ages. The dance plague is also a crisis of the search for meaning. Medieval people had to find meaning in the suffering they experienced. Explanations such as God's wrath, demonic intervention, or divine testing filled this void of meaning. Dance was the bodily manifestation of this search for meaning. When a person cannot understand why they are suffering, the body begins to ask this question through movement. In the modern world, the crisis of meaning manifests itself in different forms. Today, people are crushed under economic pressures, speed, loneliness, and constant performance expectations, rather than divine curses. However, the result is often similar. Burnout, anxiety disorders, mass stress, and collective behavioral changes are the silent dances of the modern age. The uncontrolled movements seen in the streets of the Middle Ages have transformed into invisible but widespread psychological reactions today. The dance plague is also a mirror that shakes the self-confidence of modern societies. Narratives of technology, science, and progress feed the idea that humanity has control over nature and itself. Yet history shows that this control is always fragile. No matter how advanced a society is, it can exhibit irrational behavior under intense stress and uncertainty. The dance plague is one of the historical proofs of this fact. This event also brings to the forefront the concept of collective responsibility. Individually, the dancing individuals might be labeled as abnormal. However, looking at the event as a whole, the real responsibility lies not with the individuals, but with the social conditions that brought them to this point. In the Middle Ages, these conditions were famine, epidemics, religious oppression, and insecurity. Today, they are inequality, speed, loneliness, and a constant state of crisis. The dance plague also reminds us that the human body is a political space. The body is not merely a biological entity, it is also a space influenced by power, belief, and culture. In the Middle Ages, the body was sought to be disciplined. The dance plague is one of the moments when this discipline collapsed. Uncontrolled bodies revealed the fragility of the established order. Therefore, the dance plague should be considered not only as a disease, but also as a social symptom. Just as fever is the body's reaction to an infection, the dance plague is a reaction to the burdens that society cannot bear. Even when the symptom disappears, the underlying causes often persist. The end of the dance plague does not mean that these problems have been solved. On the contrary, societies have continued to experience similar crises in new forms. Human history is full of such cycles. The dance plague is one of the most striking and visible moments in this cycle. To recount this event today is not only to document the past, but also to warn modern humanity. The human mind and body cannot withstand unlimited pressure. Societies deprived of meaning, security, and solidarity will sooner or later produce bodily or behavioral responses. This response is sometimes dance, sometimes silence, and sometimes a collective collapse. The dance plague is therefore not a historical footnote, but a long warning text written for humanity. Reading this text is not about laughing at medieval people, it is about looking at ourselves. Because even if conditions change, human fragility does not. And perhaps the simplest truth that remains at the end of this long narrative is this: when a person cannot speak, the body speaks. When society does not listen, the crisis expresses itself through movement. The dance plague is one of the loudest voices of this silent cry in history. For more informative videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.